The crowd went silent as the axe fell. A boy's head rolled across the wooden scaffold, and the people of Naples gasped in horror. Blood ran down the planks, staining the earth red. This was no common execution. It was the brutal end of Conradin, the last heir of the mighty Hohenstaufen dynasty. Only 16 years old, he wasn't just killed. He was erased. This was a message written in blood, a warning to anyone who dared to challenge power. But how did a boy, born to be king, end up on a public scaffold? To understand his death, we have to go back to the day he was born into a dying empire. Conradin was born in 1252 into a world already on fire. His grandfather was Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most brilliant and controversial rulers in history. People called him Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. He spoke 6 languages, debated with scholars, and dreamed of uniting his lands from Germany to Sicily into one mighty empire. But that dream came with enemies, powerful ones. For years, Europe was torn apart by 2 sides: the Guelphs, loyal to the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who supported the emperor. This wasn't just politics. It was a war for control of heaven and earth. And in the middle stood the Hohenstaufen family. The emperors the church wanted gone forever. The popes feared Frederick's power. They couldn't stand the thought of Rome being surrounded by a single empire that could crush their influence. So they called crusades not against Muslims, but against fellow Christians, the emperors themselves. By the time Frederick died in 1250, his empire was broken, his allies scattered, and his family name cursed by the church. 2 years later, his grandson Conradin was born, not into glory but into chaos. His father, Conrad IV, inherited what was left of the empire, but he died when Conradin was only 2 years old. That left the baby boy with more titles than toys: King of Jerusalem, Duke of Swabia, and the rightful King of Sicily. But all of these crowns were empty. He was a king with no kingdom. Growing up far from the land he was meant to rule, Conradin was raised in Bavaria under the care of his uncle, Duke Louis. He was described by chroniclers as a boy of striking beauty and noble spirit. While he studied Latin, rode horses, and learned the ways of chivalry, others were plotting to steal what was rightfully his. In Sicily, Conradin's own uncle, Manfred, the illegitimate son of Frederick II, seized power. Manfred ruled well but feared the church, so he spread a deadly rumor that young Conradin was dead. With that lie, he took the throne for himself. The papacy, now led by Pope Clement V, saw its chance. The Pope wanted a ruler who would obey him completely, not a proud German emperor. So he looked to France. There he found Charles of Anjou, the ambitious brother of King Louis IX. Ruthless, disciplined, and hungry for power, Charles was the perfect weapon. The Pope promised him the crown of Sicily, if he could take it by force. In 1266, at the Battle of Benevento, Charles and his veteran French knights destroyed Manfred's army. Manfred was killed, his body stripped and buried under a bridge. The Pope's champion had triumphed. The Hohenstaufen line, the family that had ruled for generations, seemed finished. But in the quiet halls of a Bavarian castle, a teenage boy was watching, listening, and waiting. The world thought the eagles of his house were dead. But soon, Conradin, the boy born in ruins, would rise to claim his destiny. When news of Manfred's death reached Germany, the old supporters of the Hohenstaufen line refused to believe that the dream was over. Cities, nobles, and soldiers who had once fought under Emperor Frederick saw a spark of hope still alive, a young prince growing up quietly in Bavaria. That boy was Conradin, now 14 years old, the last true heir of the empire that had once ruled half of Europe. Envoys and messengers began to arrive one after another, kneeling before him and begging him to return to Italy. They told him that the people were ready to rise, that the banners of the old empire would fly again, and that even Rome itself longed to see a Hohenstaufen king. They promised him money, armies, and glory. For Conradin, this was more than just a call to war. It was a call to destiny. He had grown up hearing stories of his grandfather, Frederick the Great, and of the empire that had been stolen from his family. Now, at just 14, he decided to take it back. He sold his lands in Germany to raise funds, gathered knights and volunteers, and formed an army. Though young, he carried himself with the confidence of a born ruler. In 1267, he crossed the Alps, riding into Italy with banners flying, the eagle of the Hohenstaufens high above him. At first, everything seemed blessed by fortune. Cities that hated the French opened their gates to him. Pavia, Pisa, and Siena joined his cause, declaring him their rightful king. Wherever he went, the people greeted him as a hero, a savior come to drive out the foreign conquerors. His army grew larger every week, and his confidence grew with it. When Conradin finally reached Rome, the moment was electric. Crowds lined the streets, cheering wildly. They called him the new Caesar. They threw flowers before his horse. The Pope and his cardinals fled the city rather than face him. For the first time in years, it seemed that the Hohenstaufen eagle might soar again. But not everyone was carried away by the excitement. In southern Italy, Charles of Anjou watched closely. He had not fought and killed Manfred just to hand the crown to another Hohenstaufen. He was cold, patient, and deadly, everything Conradin was not. Charles gathered his army of veteran French knights, men hardened by years of war. He knew that the boy king's strength was his youth, and also his weakness. The two forces met on August 23, 1268, near the town of Tagliacozzo. Conradin's army outnumbered the French. The battle began with a fierce charge from the German and Italian knights. They struck hard, smashing into Charles's front line and forcing it to retreat. The Hohenstaufen banner rose high. Victory seemed certain, but it was a trick. The retreating French were bait, a trap carefully planned by Charles himself. The man killed and mistaken for Charles was only a decoy. The real king waited behind a hill with 800 elite knights, silent and ready. When Conradin's men broke formation to celebrate and loot the enemy camp, Charles gave the signal. His hidden cavalry thundered over the hill, slamming into Conradin's scattered troops. Panic swept through the ranks. What moments earlier looked like victory turned into chaos. By sunset, the young king's army was destroyed. Thousands lay dead. Conradin barely escaped with a handful of friends, including his closest companion, Frederick of Baden. The boy who had been hailed as the new Caesar was now a fugitive, running for his life through a land that had just cheered his name. He rode south toward the coast, hoping to find a ship to Sicily. But at Astura near the sea, betrayal was waiting. Local lords, who once promised loyalty, seized him and handed him over to Charles of Anjou. The young lion had been captured. Now, in the dark dungeons of Naples, the last hope of the Hohenstaufen dynasty sat in chains, a prisoner of the man who had sworn to erase his bloodline forever. The young king, who had marched into Italy full of dreams, now sat in chains inside the cold walls of Castel dell'Ovo, the egg castle of Naples. Outside, the sea crashed against the rocks. Inside, Conradin, only 16 years old, waited for a decision that would seal not just his fate, but the fate of his entire dynasty. For Charles of Anjou, the choice was simple and cruel. He knew that as long as Conradin lived, he would remain a symbol of rebellion, a spark that could reignite the flames of war. To the Ghibellines, the boy was still the rightful king. To the people, he was a hero betrayed. Charles could not risk that symbol surviving. He said the words that showed exactly how cold his heart was. The life of Conradin is the death of Charles. The death of Conradin is the life of Charles. There would be no mercy. A trial was arranged, but everyone knew the outcome before it even began. The charges were absurd. Treason against the very kingdom he had been born to rule. The judges were handpicked by Charles, and the sentence was decided before the trial even started. When the guards brought the verdict to his cell, they found Conradin calmly playing chess with his best friend, Frederick of Baden. They were just two boys, trying to hold on to normal moments before the end. When told they were to die the next morning, they didn't cry or beg. They simply finished their game. On the morning of October 29, 1268, a massive scaffold was built in Naples' main marketplace. the Piazza del Mercato. Charles wanted everyone to see this. The stage was not just for execution, it was for humiliation, a public warning written in blood. As the crowd gathered, people whispered in disbelief. Executing a grown man for rebellion was one thing, but killing a 16-year-old boy, a king by birthright, was something else. Even many of Charles's own men felt uneasy. Yet the king himself watched from a balcony, cold and unblinking. Conradin was brought out first, dressed simply, his hands bound. The people wept and cried out for mercy, but he walked with quiet dignity. Witnesses said he looked like a prince from a story, calm, pale, and fearless. When he reached the top of the scaffold, Conradin declared his innocence. Then, in a final act of defiance, he pulled off one of his gloves and threw it down into the crowd. It wasn't a sign of surrender, it was a message. That glove, legend says, was later carried to the royal house of Aragon, whose kings would one day use it as their right to claim Sicily. Conradin then looked toward the sky and said his last words, "O mother, what sorrow I cause you." The executioner raised the axe. A moment of silence. Then a single terrible sound, the blade hitting wood and bone. The boy's head fell, the crowd screamed. Many covered their faces or fell to their knees. Some fainted. Blood soaked the platform, dripping into the soil of Naples. Next came Frederick of Baden, his loyal friend. According to legend, he picked up Conradin's head, kissed it gently, and whispered a farewell before being executed himself. With that final stroke, the last hope of the Hohenstaufen line was gone. But something happened that day that even Charles could not silence. Chroniclers wrote that as Conradin's blood ran down the scaffold, a great eagle appeared in the sky. It circled once, dipped its wing into the blood, and then soared away, as if heaven itself was protesting the crime. Charles of Anjou had won the battle, but he had lost his soul. Across Europe, horror and outrage spread like wildfire. People saw Conradin not as a traitor, but as a martyr, a symbol of courage crushed by tyranny. Songs and poems were written about him. Paintings showed the Pope and Charles as villains. Even centuries later, during the Protestant Reformation, artists used his story to condemn the corruption of the Church. 14 years later, in 1282, Sicily exploded in rebellion during the Sicilian Vespers. The people rose against the French occupiers, shouting for vengeance. Death to the French. Thousands were slaughtered. And when the rebels needed a new ruler, they turned to the House of Aragon, the same family that had once received Conradin's glove. Charles had killed a boy to secure his crown, and in the end, that act destroyed half his kingdom. Years later, Conradin's mother built a church near the site of his execution, Santa Maria del Carmine. There, his remains lie beside those of his faithful friend, Frederick. A statue of two young knights marks their tomb, eternal companions, bound by loyalty and tragedy. Conradin's death was meant to erase a name from history. Instead, it carved that name deeper into it. The boy king became a legend, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage can outlive cruelty. If you love uncovering forgotten stories like this one, tales of power, betrayal, and lost kings, hit subscribe. Ring the bell and join us for more journeys into history's darkest corners, because sometimes the past isn't dead, it's just waiting to be remembered.